The greatest minds in history are often defined not by the answers they provide, but by the profound questions they dare to leave unanswered. St. Augustine of Hippo, the towering intellectual architect of the Western Church, offered definitive clarity on grace, sin, and the nature of salvation. Yet when he turned his gaze inward to examine the most basic, inescapable reality of human life, he encountered an intellectual wall he could not breach. This wall was built from the very substance of our lived experience, forcing the doctor of grace to confess a fundamental, bewildering ignorance. The question that humbled Augustine was simple, universal, and utterly devastating to human reason. What exactly is time? Augustine's investigation into time is not found in a dry treatise on metaphysics, but within the deeply personal, prayerful context of his spiritual autobiography, the Confessions. As the narrative shifts in Book 11, the focus moves away from the drama of his personal conversion, his struggle with lust, ambition, and Manichaeism, and pivots toward a direct, intense philosophical dialogue with God. This shift transforms the abstract pursuit of knowledge into an act of worship. The question of time, for Augustine, is inseparable from the question of creation and the nature of the eternal Creator. He approaches the problem not as a detached philosopher, but as a soul seeking to understand the very medium in which its pilgrimage takes place. The specific theological problem that first ignited this inquiry was a popular skeptical challenge posed by the Manichaeans, a dualistic sect Augustine had once followed. They would mockingly ask, "What was God doing before he made heaven and earth?" This query attempts to trap God within a linear timeline, suggesting that if God suddenly decided to create, he must have been idle for an infinite before. Augustine dismisses this heretical question with an absolute decisive clarity. His famous reply is that God was not doing anything precisely because there was no before. The notion of before requires time, and God is the creator of time itself. To ask what God was doing before creation is like asking where the circle's corner is. The question presupposes a category that simply does not apply. This philosophical basis rests upon the essential distinction between divine eternity, or eternitas, and human time, or tempus. God exists in an eternal, simultaneous present, which medieval theologians later termed the nunc stans, the standing now. For God, there is no sequence of past, present, and future. All of history is held in a single, unified gaze. Time, therefore, is not an independent container into which God poured creation. Rather, time is itself a creature, a created property of the universe. Augustine argues that time exists only because change exists. If nothing ever changed, if all things remained perfectly static and simultaneous, then there would be no time. There would only be eternity. Time is defined by its very movement, its passing nature. Having solved the Manichaean trap by defining God as the creator of time, Augustine finds himself staring directly into the abyss of his own creation. The initial theological defense gives way to a profound philosophical crisis. If God created time, what exactly did he create? The exact formulation of the unanswerable question found in Confessions. Book 11, Chapter 14 is one of the most celebrated statements in intellectual history. Augustine writes, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to a questioner, I do not know." This is the core paradox that defines the human relationship with temporality. We possess an immediate, intuitive, and undeniable grasp of time. We know what it means to wait, to remember, to anticipate. We schedule our lives, measure our progress, and feel the weight of its passage. Yet the moment we attempt to capture that intuition in the rigid structures of human language and reason, the concept dissolves into contradiction. This confession of intellectual failure is not a sign of weakness, but a powerful demonstration of the intellectual humility necessary for theological insight. Augustine, the most rigorous mind of his age, willingly admits the limitations of human reason when confronted with the boundary conditions of existence. This acknowledgement of human limitation is, paradoxically, the necessary first step toward divine truth. If we cannot define time, something we experience constantly, how can we expect to define God, who is beyond all experience? Augustine begins his deconstruction of time by examining its three dimensions: the past, the future, and the present. His analysis quickly reveals that two of these dimensions lack any true ontological status. That is, they do not truly exist. The past is no longer and the future is not yet. This seems self-evident, yet it creates a staggering logical problem. If the past has ceased to be and the future has yet to begin its existence, how can we possibly measure them? We habitually speak of a long time ago, or a short time in the future, implying that we are measuring duration. But how can duration be measured in something that has no being? If we try to measure a past event, say the Trojan War, we are not measuring the event itself, which is gone. We are measuring something else. If we try to measure the time until a future event, such as next week's meeting, we are measuring something that has not yet manifested in reality. This logical quandary forces Augustine to reject the most common external definitions of time. He specifically refutes the established cosmological view of time prevalent in Aristotelian and Stoic philosophy, which defined time as the movement of the sun, moon, or stars. This was the common-sense definition of time, the revolution of the celestial sphere. Augustine powerfully dismantles this idea. He argues that motion occurs in time, but motion is not time. If all the heavenly bodies were miraculously halted, if the sun stood still, the moon froze, and the stars ceased their cosmic dance, would time stop? No, he concludes, because we could still speak, still think, and still measure the duration of our thoughts and words. Furthermore, he points out that we measure the speed of motion by time. We say a car is moving 60 miles per hour. If time itself were merely motion, the definition would be circular and meaningless. We would be measuring motion by motion. Therefore, time must be a prerequisite for movement, not movement itself. Time is something deeper, something more elusive than the clockwork of the cosmos. With the past and the future deemed non-existent and external motion dismissed as the definition of time, Augustine is left with only the present moment. Logically, the present must be the only dimension that truly exists. Yet, when he subjects the present moment to rigorous philosophical scrutiny, it too vanishes. The present moment is the point of transition, the knife edge between the future and the past. Augustine asks, does the present have duration? If the present moment were extended, if it lasted for a minute or even a second, that duration could be mentally divided into a part that has already passed, the past, and a part that is yet to come, the future. If the present is divisible, it is not truly the present. It is a small segment of time composed of past and future. Therefore, the present moment must be a non-extended, infinitesimal point, an instant that flies at such lightning speed that it is gone the very moment it arrives. This leads to the ultimate dilemma of temporal magnitude. If the past does not exist, and the future does not exist, and the present has no duration, how can time itself have duration? How can time accumulate? We speak of decades, centuries, and millennia, yet these large durations are composed of parts that, upon inspection, either do not exist or have no dimension. The entire concept of time collapses under the weight of logical analysis. It is at this point of absolute logical despair that Augustine makes his revolutionary intellectual move, one that fundamentally shifts the inquiry into time for the next 1500 years. He realizes that the error lies in looking outward. If time cannot be located in external phenomena, it must be located internally, in the consciousness of the person experiencing it. Time is not in the stars, time is in the soul. Augustine thus introduces his famous subjective solution, the concept of the threefold present. We do not measure the past, the present, or the future as external realities, but as internal states of the mind. He proposes that time exists not as objective reality, but as a distension of the mind. The three dimensions of time are redefined as three aspects of the mind's current engagement. First, the present of things past, which is memory, memoria. Second, the present of things present, which is attention, contuitus or praesentia. Third, the present of things future, which is expectation, expectatio. This tripartite definition solves the measurement problem. We do not measure the past event itself, which is gone. Instead, we measure the image, the trace, or the impression of that event as it resides present in our memory. When we measure the length of a poem we once read, we are measuring the duration of the impression that remains in our mind, not the objective reading time, which has already passed. Similarly, we do not measure the future event, which has no being. We measure the expectation of that event, the mental intention or projection we hold now. As the future event approaches, expectation fades into attention, and attention quickly gives way to memory. Time is the continuous, dynamic process of the soul's internal structuring of these three cognitive states. This leads Augustine to his final, profound conclusion encapsulated in the Latin phrase, Distentio Animi. Time is a distentio animi, a distension or stretching out of the soul or mind. The Latin word distentio carries significant weight and ambiguity. It can be interpreted both passively and actively. Passively, it means a being stretched out or scattered, a feeling of being pulled apart by the endless succession of events. The soul is dispersed into the non-existent dimensions of the past and the future. Actively, however, it can also imply a stretching toward, a dynamic movement of the soul in anticipation and recollection. Regardless of the precise nuance, the central point is established. The anima, the soul or mind, is the sole locus of time's existence. Time is not a physical phenomenon, it is a spiritual one. The duration we feel and measure is not the duration of things in the external world, but the duration of the impression those things make upon our minds. Augustine connects this measurement directly to affectio, or affection and emotion. Time is measured as the affectionem, the impression, feeling, or emotional resonance that passing things make upon the soul. This links time intimately to subjective, emotional, and psychological experience, making the experience of time intensely personal. A happy moment flies by, a moment of suffering drags on, because the affectio changes the perceived distentio. Reflecting on how Augustine reached this profound conclusion about the soul's scattering was not a purely academic exercise, but the result of decades of intense, painful self-examination. The philosophical inquiry into time in Book 11 is the logical culmination of the spiritual autobiography detailed in the preceding 10 books. Augustine had to first understand his own scattered life, his years lost to hedonism and intellectual wandering, before he could grasp the concept of the soul's temporal fragmentation. For those seeking to understand the foundational spiritual journey that led to this intellectual breakthrough, the original source remains indispensable. We highly recommend The Confessions of St. Augustine. It is a fundamental spiritual autobiography, detailing Augustine's personal path from paganism and Manichaeism to the unwavering conviction of Christianity. The book explores crucial themes that underpin his philosophy of time, including sin, grace, memory, and the restless desire of the human heart. It is the roadmap to his inner world, showing how his intellectual rigor was forged in the fire of his personal struggles. This resource provides the necessary context for understanding why the problem of time became a spiritual crisis for him. And for those who prefer a more comfortable reading experience, this book is available in a large print edition, making the profound text easier on the eyes. You can find the link to this essential resource in the description below. The spiritual and existential consequence of distentio is immense. Augustine laments his state of fragmentation, crying out, "I am scattered in times whose order I do not understand. My thoughts, the inmost parts of my soul, are torn to pieces by the tumultuous changes of time. Distentio is thus understood as a state of fallenness, a spiritual malady. The soul scattering into the endless succession of past and future is a deviation from the simple, unified, and stable present of God. In God's eternity there is only unity. In human time there is only multiplicity and change. The human soul created for unity with God finds itself dispersed, unable to hold the whole of its being together in one coherent moment. This theological tension reflects a strong influence from Neoplatonism, which Augustine expertly synthesized with Christian doctrine. The Neoplatonic idea is that the soul's turning away from the one, God, and plunging into the material world of multiplicity and change is precisely what manifests as temporal experience. Time is the measure of the soul's distance from its eternal source. If distentio is the problem, the soul's scattering, then the spiritual remedy must be found in the counter-movement. Intentio. Intentio means stretching toward, or purpose, or intent. It is the deliberate spiritual act of refusing to be pulled apart by the past's regrets or the future's anxieties. Instead, the soul gathers its fragmented attention and directs it toward a single, unified goal: God. Augustine explicitly spiritualizes the time problem by connecting it to the writings of St. Paul. He references the apostle's call to stretch forward to those things which are before, found in Philippians chapter 3, verse 13. This Pauline verse becomes the theological key to unlocking the philosophical puzzle of time. The purpose of human time is not merely to be endured, but to be utilized as a pilgrimage of intentio toward the eternal unified life with God. The final act of measuring time, therefore, is transformed from a detached observation into a radical self-measurement. When we measure time, we are, in essence, measuring the duration of our own spiritual progress. We are measuring the distance between where we are now, attention, what we have learned, memory, and where we are striving to be, expectation, all while ensuring that this entire framework is directed toward the ultimate unchanging reality of eternity. The legacy of Augustine's unanswerable question is immense, foundational, and continues to shape philosophical inquiry today. By shifting the investigation of time from cosmology to consciousness, Augustine established himself as the first great philosopher of subjective time, laying the groundwork for phenomenology and existentialism centuries later. His influence permeates modern thought, often in ways that are subtle but profound. He provided the initial framework for understanding temporality as an internal structure rather than an external flow. Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, grappled extensively with Augustine's insight. Husserl's concept of the living present, which posits that consciousness continually holds the just past retention and the immediately coming protension within the present moment, is a direct, secularized refinement of Augustine's threefold present of memory, attention, and expectation. Augustine's analysis provided the essential language for describing how the mind synthesizes the flow of time. Perhaps the most significant, though sometimes critically filtered, influence is seen in the work of Martin Heidegger. In his monumental work, Being and Time, Heidegger sought to ground human existence, Dasein, in temporality. Heidegger viewed Augustine's meditation in the Confessions as the authentic depth of the work, recognizing that Augustine had already located time in the soul's being. Heidegger adopted Augustine's insight that temporality is the structure of the soul, but he radically secularized the conclusion. Where Augustine saw distentio as a fallen state from which the soul must strive toward God, intentio, Heidegger saw human temporality as inherently finite, culminating in death, sein zum Tode. For Heidegger, the stretching out of the soul is its authentic being toward death, not its striving toward eternity. Yet the foundational move, the realization that time is the being of the soul, originated with Augustine. Furthermore, the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, in his extensive analysis in Time and Narrative, positions Augustine's aporia, the inability to define time despite knowing it, as the starting point for all subsequent philosophical and narrative attempts to cope with temporal experience. Augustine's problem defines the human struggle to reconcile lived time with cosmic time. Theologically, Augustine's wrestling with time opens up crucial paradoxes regarding human freedom and divine sovereignty. If all time is an eternal present to God, and God sees all of history simultaneously, how can human creatures possess genuine freedom to choose? If our future is already present to God, is our journey merely a fixed path being played out? Augustine's answer, though complex, maintains that God's timeless knowledge does not cause our choices. It merely encompasses them. God's knowledge is outside the sequence of cause and effect that defines human time. Our freedom is real within the created framework of tempus, even though God's vision transcends that framework in eternitas. This theological synthesis finds its ultimate resolution in the paradox of the Incarnation. Christ, as the Word made flesh, is the intersection of the eternal, eternitas, and the temporal, tempus. God enters the Distentio Animi of humanity. He submits to the constraints of measurable passing time, taking on a specific birth date, a specific lifespan, and a historical death. The Incarnation is God's divine intervention into the soul's scattering. By becoming temporal, Christ offers humanity a path to gather its scattered fragments, transforming the passive distentio into the active intentio. He anchors the temporal pilgrimage to the eternal destination. The final goal of Augustine's entire inquiry, and the deepest meaning of the threefold present, lies in the concept of memoria Dei, the memory of God. The ultimate purpose of memory is not mere recollection of the past, but the recollection of God's constant eternal presence. God is the source of all time, and thus the truest memory is the memory of the Creator who is always nunc stans, always standing in the present. The question of what is time is unanswerable not because time is nothing, but because it is too intimately tied to the mystery of the soul's relationship with its eternal Creator. Time is the shadow of eternity cast upon the mutable world. To define time would be to define the soul, and to define the soul would be to define the image of God within us. A task that exceeds the grasp of human language. Augustine's profound inquiry ultimately teaches us that the limits of reason are not a barrier to truth, but a sacred boundary marking the beginning of faith. When logic fails to grasp the nature of time, faith must step in to grasp the nature of the timeless one. His prayer, following his extensive analysis, is not a demand for an answer, but a desperate plea for spiritual unification. A call to God to gather the scattered fragments of his soul, his distentio, and unite them in the eternal, perfect present of divine life. Time, for Augustine, is not a problem to be solved by logical dissection, but a mystery to be lived through faith and directed by love. We are not meant to master time with our intellect, but to master ourselves within time through spiritual discipline. The one question St. Augustine could not answer, "What is time?" is the question that perfectly defines the human condition. It is the struggle of the temporal self, fragmented and fleeting, to grasp the nature of its own existence, even as it yearns for permanence. The resolution, the spiritual answer to the intellectual failure, is not a definition, but an orientation. Our life must be a continuous, conscious movement from distentio, the state of being scattered and dispersed in the anxieties of temporality, to intentio, the focused and purposeful act of being unified in the eternal reality of God. In this movement, the mystery of time finds its meaning. If these words speak to you, you're not here by chance. Subscribe, like, and share your thoughts below. Each simple action helps this message reach more hearts and reminds me that this work still has meaning.